Looking back, I never expected things to go this way. It's funny how you think you know someone after years of marriage, only to find out you don't. I married Lily nearly a decade ago. We had what I thought was a happy life together, the kind of marriage that seemed to check all the boxes. We laughed, argued, celebrated, and struggled, just like any other couple. We were partners, best friends, at least, that's what I believed. It wasn't until recently that I started to notice subtle changes in her. Little things that, in hindsight, now seem like neon signs. She began dressing up more, spending extra time getting ready, even on casual days. I told myself it was nothing. She deserved to feel good about herself, right? I never wanted to be the insecure husband who questioned her intentions. But then came the nights when she stayed out late, blaming work events or client dinners. I trusted her. I thought she was just dedicated to her job, which I respected. But I remember this one night when she didn't come home until past midnight, smelling like cologne that definitely wasn't mine. I brushed it off, thinking it was just paranoia, or that maybe she'd hugged a coworker or something. Then, one day, I found a message on her phone from a man named Anthony. The words were flirtatious, intimate, a far cry from any professional exchange. My hands shook as I read through them, the reality of her betrayal sinking in. But even then, I tried to rationalize it, to come up with reasons for why these messages could mean something innocent. When I confronted her, she couldn't deny it. She admitted to an affair with Anthony, a well-known businessman in our area, charming and wealthy. It hit me like a punch to the gut. I remember standing there, numb, as she confessed. Lily's words seemed distant, like they were coming from somewhere far away, a place I couldn't reach. She wasn't apologizing, not really. She just kept repeating that she never meant to hurt me. I felt like she was trying to justify her actions, saying that Anthony understood her in ways I couldn't, that he offered her excitement and adventure. The betrayal felt like a knife, twisting deeper with each word. Here was the woman I had loved and trusted, admitting that she had found something with someone else. I'd worked so hard to provide for us, to build a life together. And this was what it all came down to, a fling with some wealthy guy who made her feel alive. When she was done talking, she looked at me like she was waiting for me to say something, anything. But I couldn't. I felt paralyzed. I walked out of the room, out of the house, just needing to breathe, to think, to figure out what I was supposed to do now that my world had shattered. I got into my car and just drove. No destination, just the open road. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, the anger and betrayal boiling inside of me. My mind raced through every moment of our life together, searching for signs I'd missed, wondering if there had been hints all along. Had she ever truly been happy with me? Or had she just been waiting for someone better to come along? I kept thinking about all the sacrifices I'd made for us. The long hours at work, the weekends spent fixing up the house instead of relaxing, the nights I would take on extra tasks just to make sure we were comfortable. I wanted a life with her, and I thought we were building something together. Turns out, I was the only one committed to that dream. Lily had taken that loyalty, that devotion, and tossed it aside like it was worth nothing. After what felt like hours, I ended up in front of her mother's house. I didn't plan on going there, but something in me needed answers, some kind of clarity, maybe even a bit of comfort. Her mother, Sandra, and I had always had a good relationship. She was straightforward and a bit rough around the edges, but she loved her daughter fiercely. I'd always respected that. So, I parked and walked up to her door, still unsure if this was the right choice. But before I could overthink it, I knocked. Sandra opened the door, and her expression shifted from surprise to concern as she took one look at my face. Come in, she said, gesturing for me to step inside. I barely made it through the doorway before I blurted it out. She's been cheating on me, Sandra. She's with someone else. Her eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, she was silent. I'd expected her to be upset, maybe even furious on my behalf. But instead, Sandra let out a long, slow sigh and walked over to her living room couch. She motioned for me to sit beside her, and I followed, the silence between us growing heavy. Anthony? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. She looked down at her hands, avoiding my gaze. When I nodded, I saw something in her expression that I couldn't quite place. A flicker of regret, maybe guilt. What is it, Sandra? Did you know about this? I asked, my voice sounding angrier than I'd intended. She hesitated, then nodded. I had my suspicions. I'd seen some things, little things, but I didn't want to believe my daughter could do something like that, especially not to you. She sighed again, this time deeper, as if trying to release a burden she'd been carrying. Anthony. I knew him years ago, long before Lily was even born. That caught me off guard. I wasn't prepared for the layers of secrets Sandra was unraveling. What do you mean, you knew him? I asked, unsure if I was ready for her answer. Sandra looked at me, a strange sadness in her eyes. I don't just know him, Colin. I once loved him too. For a moment, the world seemed to stop, the weight of her words settling over me, heavier than anything I'd felt that night. The air felt thick between us. I stared at Sandra, trying to process what she just said. She looked away, almost ashamed, her gaze fixed on some invisible point in the distance. It was like she was sifting through memories she'd buried long ago, memories that now, somehow, connected all of us in a twisted way I never could have imagined. Colin, she finally began, her voice low and careful. Anthony and I were involved, deeply, before I met Lily's father. He was one of those men who could make you feel like you were the only person in the room. He had this confidence, this charm, and back then, I was young and drawn to that. It was intense, passionate even, but it was also fleeting. He left, as men like that do, and I moved on. I never thought I'd see him again. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't just some random businessman who had charmed his way into my wife's life. This was a man who had been tangled in her family's history long before I even met her. The betrayal felt so much deeper now, as if it reached down through the generations, pulling up old wounds that hadn't truly healed. Sandra looked at me, her expression raw and conflicted. I never told Lily about him. Why would I? It was just a chapter in my life I thought I'd closed. And when she started mentioning him a few years back, I couldn't believe it was the same man. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. But then, I saw him at one of those charity events she dragged me to. I realized it was him. The same Anthony I'd been foolish enough to fall for all those years ago. Her voice broke a little, and she took a shaky breath. I warned her, Colin. I told her he wasn't the kind of man she should trust. But she laughed it off, said I was overreacting, that he was different now. I think part of me wanted to believe her. The weight of her words settled over me, and I felt a strange, hollow ache. I was hurt, angry, betrayed. But part of me also felt an odd sense of pity for Sandra. She, too, had fallen for Anthony's charm, and now, decades later, she was watching her daughter make the same mistake. He's poison, Colin, Sandra continued, her tone turning sharp. He was poison back then, and he's poison now. I should have done more, said Moore. I thought Lily was smarter, that she would see through him. She clenched her fists, her frustration palpable. But that's the thing with men like him. They make you feel like you're missing out on something if you don't take the chance. They make you feel special. A bitter laugh escaped her. And look where it got us. Me, sitting here, helpless as I watch my daughter ruin her marriage. And you, left to pick up the pieces of a life you thought was real. She looked at me, tears brimming in her eyes. I'm so sorry, Colin. I'm sorry I didn't protect you from this, from him, from all of it. Her apology was genuine, but it couldn't erase what had happened. As Sandra sat there, visibly drained from her confession, I realized I had so many more questions than I had answers. How could Anthony have just reappeared like this, disrupting not only her life but mine, too? And why did he feel entitled to slide into Lily's life so easily, as if the pain he'd left in his past didn't matter? Do you think Lily even knows? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Does she know about you and Anthony? Sandra shook her head slowly, her lips pressed together in a tight line. No, she replied. I never told her, and he wouldn't either. That's not his style. He doesn't want anyone to know how easily he slips in and out of lives, how he leaves people to deal with the aftermath. Anthony's not the type to take responsibility for anything, Colin. He never was. She paused, her fingers twisting a ring on her hand. But I wonder now if part of me should have told her. Maybe it would have saved her. There was a long silence as her words sank in. I felt like I was unraveling, like everything I thought I understood about Lily, about our marriage, was breaking apart. Here I was, standing in a shattered life, while this man, a ghost from Sandra's past, had somehow resurrected himself and infected my wife with the same toxic charm he'd once used on her mother. It was sickening to think about. Sandra's eyes met mine, and I could see a deep sadness there, a sadness I hadn't noticed before. She reached out, hesitantly, and put a hand on my shoulder. "Colin, you don't deserve this. You didn't ask for any of this. And if I'd known," she trailed off, and I could see the remorse pooling in her eyes. "If I'd known he'd come back, I would have warned you sooner. I should have warned you sooner. Maybe that would have made a difference." I let out a bitter laugh. "Maybe," I said, not really believing it. "Or maybe this was bound to happen no matter what we did. Lily made her choice. She didn't have to fall for him. She didn't have to betray me." I looked down, my fists clenched, feeling the rage boil up again. "But she did. And now we're here." Sandra nodded, her hand slipping from my shoulder. "You're right," she said softly. "At the end of the day, it was her choice. And I wish to God she'd chosen differently." She leaned back, sighing heavily. "I don't know what kind of hold he has on her, but I can tell you that for people like him, it's never enough. They don't feel love the way the rest of us do. They just take and take until there's nothing left." I knew that what she was saying was true. I'd seen the emptiness in Lily's eyes when I confronted her, the way she barely seemed to register the pain she'd caused. It was as if I was just collateral damage, something to be brushed aside in her pursuit of whatever thrill she'd convinced herself Anthony could give her. "Colin," Sandra said, her voice wavering, "I know it's not my place to say this, but you have every right to walk away from this. You deserve better than what she's giving you. I don't know what you're planning to do, but whatever choice you make, know that you have my support." Her words offered some comfort, a small anchor in a storm I hadn't seen coming. But what she couldn't give me, and what I was desperate to find, was peace with what had happened. As I sat there with Sandra, the silence between us grew heavier, loaded with regrets and what-ifs. I could tell that part of her wanted me to fight for Lily, to somehow pull her back from the edge she had thrown herself over. But that wasn't my responsibility, not anymore. The woman I'd married, the woman I'd trusted, had already chosen someone else. She decided I wasn't enough, and nothing I did now would change that. I thanked Sandra quietly and got up to leave. She grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "Colin, don't let this destroy you," she whispered. "People like Anthony, they don't care about the damage they leave behind. But don't give him the satisfaction of watching you fall apart because of his actions. He doesn't deserve that power." I nodded, appreciating her words, though the ache in my chest was far too deep to be soothed so easily. I walked out into the night, her words echoing in my mind. Anthony didn't deserve to hold power over me, but that didn't stop him from having it. His shadow was cast over every part of my life now, a looming figure standing between Lily and me, between my past and my future. Back in my car, I sat in the darkness, letting the cool night air fill the space as I tried to process everything. I knew what Sandra said was true, but knowing didn't make it hurt any less. I felt like I'd lost not just Lily, but also the life I thought we were building together, the memories that now felt hollow. The last few years seemed like an illusion, a facade that had shattered in an instant. As I sat there, I realized that if I wanted any sort of peace, I needed to do more than just walk away from this marriage. I needed to make sure Anthony didn't continue to linger over my life like a toxic presence. I needed to take some action, even if it was for my own closure. I had no desire to confront him directly, not yet, at least, but I knew I needed to find a way to take back control, to make my own choices instead of just reacting to his. That night, I didn't go home. I couldn't face Lily, not with everything Sandra had told me swirling around in my head. Instead, I drove aimlessly until I found myself at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. I checked in, feeling like some cliché character in a tragic story, but I didn't care. I needed space, a night away from the home that felt like a lie, The bed where Lily and I had once shared our dreams, dreams that had clearly meant nothing to her in the end. Lying on the lumpy mattress, I stared at the ceiling, trying to piece together a plan. Part of me wanted to disappear, to leave everything behind and never look back. But I knew I couldn't run from this. I couldn't let Anthony's presence chase me out of my own life. I had friends here, a career I'd built from scratch, roots that ran deeper than the betrayal Lily had dragged into our marriage. I resolved then and there that I wouldn't be a passive victim in this. I would confront Lily, demand answers from her, and decide once and for all what I needed to move forward. Whether she wanted to fight for our marriage or not, I deserved the truth. And if she couldn't give me that, then at least I would walk away with my dignity intact, knowing I hadn't just let someone else steal away my life. In that dimly lit room, I found a glimmer of purpose, the beginning of something that felt like strength. The next morning, I woke up with a stiff neck from the motel bed, feeling the weight of everything settle over me again. The clarity I'd felt the night before now seemed like a distant memory, blurred by exhaustion and the creeping doubt that maybe none of this would ever make sense. But I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. I had to face Lily, confront her with everything I knew, and demand the truth she'd been hiding from me. On the drive home, I rehearsed what I wanted to say, but the words felt slippery, like they'd vanish as soon as I needed them. What do you even say to someone who's betrayed you so completely? How do you look them in the eye and ask them to explain the one thing you never thought they were capable of doing? Part of me feared her answer, feared it would confirm that she'd been unhappy for far longer than I'd realized, that I'd been nothing more than a placeholder in her life while she waited for something better to come along. When I finally stepped through the front door, the house was quiet. Lily was in the kitchen, her back to me as she washed dishes, completely unaware that her world was about to be turned upside down. The sight of her, so calm, so unbothered, sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through me. How could she stand there, carrying on as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't already destroyed everything between us? I cleared my throat, and she turned, surprise flickering across her face. "Colin, where were you last night?" she asked, a slight edge of worry in her voice. But I wasn't about to be distracted by her concern. "Not this time. We need to talk," I said, my tone colder than I intended. Her face shifted, a mix of defensiveness and guilt creeping in. She must have known this moment was coming. She'd been expecting it ever since she confessed the affair. "I thought we already did," she said, setting down the dish she'd been holding. Her voice was quiet, almost resigned, as if she was bracing herself for the fallout. "No, Lily, we didn't. You gave me the bare minimum, enough to ease your guilt, but not enough to give me the full truth." I stepped closer, my hands clenching at my sides. Why Anthony? Why him, of all people? And why lie to me for so long? I deserve an honest answer. She looked away, biting her lip, and for a moment, I saw something break in her expression. She looked vulnerable, almost as if she regretted what she'd done. But then, just as quickly, her gaze hardened, and she straightened her shoulders. "You wouldn't understand, Colin. It's complicated." "Complicated?" I nearly laughed at that. "Try me, Lily. Explain how betraying your husband with a man who once had a relationship with your own mother is complicated." Her face went pale at that. "My mother told you," she whispered, a mix of shock and anger flashing in her eyes. "Yes, she told me. She told me everything." I let the silence hang there, hoping the weight of her choices would finally sink in. "How could you, Lily? After everything we've been through, how could you bring him into our lives like this?" She closed her eyes, her hands trembling. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Colin. I didn't know what I was doing. He made me feel alive, like I was someone else for a while. Someone I wanted to be." "So you wanted to be with him more than with me," I said quietly, the realization sinking in deeper than ever. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "It wasn't about that. It was never about replacing you. It was about escaping the life that sometimes feels so heavy." The words cut me, but they also felt like the final, undeniable truth. I stood there, the weight of her words pressing down on me like lead. "Escaping?" I repeated, struggling to keep my voice steady. You wanted to escape your life with me? With the life we built together? The life we promised each other? Lily dropped her gaze, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the kitchen counter. She looked small, almost childlike, as if she was shrinking under the burden of her own choices. Colin, I never wanted to hurt you. But yes, sometimes I felt trapped. Trapped by expectations, by routines, she paused, her voice catching, by a version of myself that felt suffocating. Suffocating? The word stung. How could she say that, after everything we'd been through together, after all the sacrifices and dreams we'd shared? I felt like I was listening to a stranger, someone who had simply worn Lily's face and borrowed her voice. You had every chance to talk to me about how you felt, to be honest, to work on it together. But instead, you chose to lie. You chose him. She swallowed, a tear slipping down her cheek. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she murmured, her voice barely audible. At first, I didn't even think it would go anywhere. I was just flattered by the attention. Anthony made me feel seen in a way that I hadn't felt in years. Her words twisted in my gut, stirring a painful mixture of anger and despair. Seen? Lily, I've been here this whole time, right in front of you, working day and night to build this life with you. You needed to feel seen, and somehow that made it okay to start an affair? With a man who's nothing but a ghost from your mother's past? She looked away, unable to meet my gaze. I know it sounds selfish. Maybe it was. But it wasn't just about you, Colin. It was about me, about things I hadn't dealt with, things I thought I could ignore. Anthony. He brought all of that to the surface in ways I didn't expect. My fists clenched at my sides, the frustration simmering within me. So you let him. You let him pull you away from everything you had, everything we had, just because he gave you attention? That's all it took? Her shoulders slumped, and she looked at me with eyes filled with regret, maybe even shame. It sounds so hollow now, I know, but it's more complicated than that. I don't expect you to understand, but I didn't go looking for him, Colin. He just found me. He knew how to say the things I needed to hear, even if they weren't true. He made me believe I was missing something, and I fell for it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was admitting it freely, almost as if it was just another fact of life, something beyond her control. So that's it, then? I asked. You throw away everything because of some half-baked fantasy? And what now, Lily? Are you planning to stay with him? To keep running after that illusion? She shook her head, her voice barely more than a whisper. No, it's over. It's been over, Colin. I was stupid, and I hurt you in ways I can never take back. Anthony's not what I want. I see that now. He was just a way for me to escape, to feel like someone else for a while. But it's done. Her words were a hollow attempt at closure, a thin apology for the mess she'd created. I stood there, feeling the life I'd known dissolve, as if her confession had finally severed whatever ties had remained between us. We stood in that kitchen, the silence pressing down like a weight neither of us could bear. I could feel my heart pounding, a mix of anger, grief, and an exhaustion that went bone deep. I wanted to scream, to tell her how she had shattered everything we'd built, to let her feel even a fraction of the pain she put me through. But standing there, looking at her, I realized that nothing I could say would ever make her understand what she destroyed. Lily, I don't think you get it, I finally said, my voice tight. You didn't just hurt me. You didn't just make a mistake. You betrayed everything we stood for, every promise we made to each other. Do you have any idea what it's like to find out that the person you trusted most in the world has been lying to you? She looked down, her hands twisting in front of her, as if she could wring the guilt out of her fingers. I do, Colin, she whispered. I do understand that now. I lost myself along the way, and by the time I realized it, I had already crossed lines I couldn't uncross. I was selfish, and I'm sorry. Sorry? I laughed, a bitter sound that felt foreign even to my own ears. What am I supposed to do with that, Lily? Sorry doesn't take back the nights you spent with him, the lies you told, the years of trust you threw away. My voice softened, almost pleading. I thought we had something real. I thought we were stronger than this. She took a shaky breath, meeting my gaze with tear-filled eyes. I thought so too. But somewhere along the line, I started questioning everything. Myself, our life, even the person I'd become. And instead of talking to you about it, I looked for answers in the wrong places. I didn't know how to face my own unhappiness, so I ran. And I know that's on me. The sadness in her voice cut through my anger, and for a fleeting moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered the messages I'd seen, the way she had so easily let another man into the space that was supposed to be ours. She hadn't just run, she had ripped apart our lives, leaving me in a wreckage she barely seemed to grasp. So, where does that leave us? I asked, my tone flat, resigned. You've apologized. You've explained yourself. But what about me, Lily? What am I supposed to do with the pieces of our life that you left behind? Am I just supposed to pick them up and pretend everything's fine? Her face crumpled, and she reached out, but I stepped back, holding up a hand to stop her. I wasn't ready for that. Not now. Maybe not ever. I want to fix this, Colin, she said, her voice breaking. I know I don't deserve a second chance, but if you can find it in yourself to forgive me, maybe we can work through this. Maybe we can rebuild. The words hung in the air, heavy with the impossibility of what she was asking. Rebuild? I echoed, feeling a strange sense of detachment. You can't just rebuild something that's been burned to the ground. You made sure of that. A silence fell between us, thicker than before. Her tears fell freely now, and for a moment, I felt a pang of the love we'd once shared, a faint reminder of why I'd chosen her all those years ago. But that love had been shattered, scattered into 1,000 pieces by her betrayal. The days that followed felt like moving through a fog. I went to work, handled my responsibilities, even made polite small talk with people, but none of it felt real. It was as if my life had been hollowed out, the pieces rearranged but no longer fitting the way they were supposed to. At home, Lily tried to give me space, but her presence was a constant reminder of the betrayal, and each time I saw her, the hurt flared up all over again. At first, I thought I'd be able to stay and somehow work through the mess she'd made of our marriage. But the truth was, every time I looked at her, all I saw was Anthony. I saw them together in my mind, the things she'd let him see and hear, the parts of herself she'd shared with him that should have been mine alone. Every touch, every glance, every laugh, they haunted me, replaying over and over like a wound that refused to heal. One night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I realized that I couldn't keep going like this. Staying in that house, with her presence so near, was tearing me apart. I needed to find a way to let go, to release myself from the memories that bound me to her betrayal. I wanted peace, even if it meant leaving everything we'd built behind. The next morning, I told Lily that I was moving out. Her face crumbled, and she begged me to reconsider, but I had made up my mind. I assured her that I wouldn't rush into any decisions, that I'd give myself time to think things over, but I needed distance to see things clearly. She offered to leave instead, to let me stay in the house, but I shook my head. I couldn't stay there. Surrounded by ghosts of the life we'd once shared, I moved into a small apartment across town, a simple place with none of the warmth or familiarity of our home. At first, the silence felt oppressive, the emptiness of the space a stark reminder of what I'd lost. But slowly, I started to find comfort in the quiet. I filled my days with work, with tasks and routines that kept my mind occupied, leaving little room for thoughts of Lily and Anthony. In those first weeks, Lily tried to reach out, sending texts and voicemails, asking if we could meet and talk things through. She wanted to go to therapy, to rebuild what we'd lost. But I ignored her messages, needing to be alone with my thoughts, to process the heartbreak without her voice lingering in my ear. One evening, I went to visit Sandra. We sat in her living room, and she listened as I poured out the anger and sadness I'd been holding inside. She offered no empty reassurances, no false promises that things would magically get better. She simply sat with me, sharing in my grief. She had known the man who'd caused this pain, known him intimately, and maybe that was why she was the only one who could truly understand the depth of the wound. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive her, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Sandra nodded, her expression filled with regret. Sometimes forgiveness isn't about the other person, Colin, she said. Sometimes it's about letting go of the hold they have over you. Those words stayed with me, lingering in my mind as I tried to find some way forward. Over the next few months, I focused on myself, finding a routine that didn't involve Lily or our shared past. I started going to the gym, spending time with friends I hadn't seen in years, and even picked up old hobbies I'd abandoned in the busyness of married life. It was hard, especially in those quiet moments when the loneliness crept in. There were times when I missed her, missed the life we'd shared before everything fell apart. But each time I felt that ache, I reminded myself of the lies, the betrayal, the nights she'd spent with another man. I knew I couldn't go back, that the past was a place I could never reclaim. One evening, as I was leaving the gym, I ran into an old friend, Ben, who I hadn't seen since college. We grabbed coffee, catching up on lost time, and he asked how Lily was doing. I hesitated, not wanting to unpack my heartache for someone who had no idea what I'd been through. But Ben was perceptive, and soon, I found myself telling him everything. He listened quietly, nodding along as I recounted the painful details. When I finished, he leaned back, a thoughtful look on his face. "It sounds like she let you down in ways no one should," he said. "But Colin, you don't have to carry her mistakes forever. You have every right to start over, to find happiness again." Ben's words sparked something in me, a sense of hope I hadn't felt in a long time. Over the next few weeks, we hung out more, reconnecting over shared memories and new experiences. He introduced me to people in his circle, people who had no ties to my past with Lily. Slowly, I found myself opening up, laughing more, feeling lighter than I had in months. One evening, Ben invited me to a small gathering at his place. I felt a mix of nerves and excitement as I walked in, realizing that I was finally starting to move forward. At the gathering, I met a woman named Kate, who had a calm, gentle presence that immediately put me at ease. We talked for hours, sharing stories, and by the end of the night, I felt a connection that reminded me that maybe, just maybe, there was life after heartbreak. As the weeks went by, Kate and I grew closer. She was understanding and patient, never pushing me to share more than I was ready to. With her, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years, a peace that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with the present. Eventually, I reached out to Lily to finalize the divorce. We met at a quiet cafe, the same place where we'd shared countless dates and celebrations. She looked worn, tired, her eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. As we went over the paperwork, there was a strange sense of closure in the air, an understanding that our paths had diverged and there was no turning back. "Colin," she said softly, her voice trembling, "I wish I could go back and undo everything. I wish I could take away the pain I caused." I nodded, feeling a strange calm wash over me. "I know," I replied, "but it's done now, and maybe it's better this way, for both of us." She looked down, wiping a tear from her cheek. There was no anger left between us, only the quiet acceptance of a life we'd once shared and the future we were both moving toward, separately. The divorce was finalized soon after, and I felt a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. My life was my own again, free from the shadow of betrayal and lies. With Kate by my side and new friends surrounding me, I began to rebuild, one small step at a time. I still had days where memories of Lily surfaced, but they no longer held the same power over me. They were just that, memories, pieces of a past life that I'd left behind. I'd found a peace I hadn't thought possible, a peace built on the hard lessons I'd learned. And as I looked toward the future, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope.